Okay, let's talk about sound editing in Reaper. So the first thing we need to do is we're going to import a sound file in here, and we're going to do some things to it. And what I will do is I will go to Insert, Media File. As you know, there's lots of ways to do this, but I have a file right here, and I'm just going to open it. But you could also drag it and drop it. You could also go to View, Media Explorer, and search for a file that way. Okay, so then by default, what Reaper will do is it will recreate a track. You don't even have to create a track. If there's no track, it'll just create one for you. And it will give the track the name of the file. That's default. You can change that by double clicking, and you can also rename it down here. Because remember, this in the mixture, this the track here corresponds to this track over here. And then the name, then what it'll do is it'll create an item, and the name of that item will be the name of the file. Now you can change that too. Before I do though, I'm going to expand this a little bit. So I'm going to put my cursor right at the bottom, and you can see that the cursor changes shape. This is very common in Reaper, and we'll see lots of other examples of that. And you can just drag it down. This makes makes the editing a little bit easier if you can see it better. And good. So, right, you can also change the name of the item. So you don't have to, the two things don't have to match. Like you could have a track name be whatever, and then you can have the item name be something else. So in this case, let's say I just want to call it scale. All I have to do is double click, and then it opens the media item properties window. There's lots of things that you could do here, but the only thing we'll worry about right now is the name. Okay, this doesn't change the name of the sound file, by the way, it just changes the name of the item. So let's just call it scale. I'm going to hit apply. Okay, so now we've renamed the item. This is called an item, and my track name, that's what Reaper already did that for us, but we could have changed it to something else. Okay, so now this item is placed on a timeline. Okay, so in this case, Reaper is set up to have 120 BPMs and to be in 4/4. So therefore, the grid is set up to be in basically in measures and beats. That's the default. You can change all of these things. Now, what I want to do just for this initial portion, and later I will come back to this file and we'll actually deal with BPMs and things like that. But for now, let's change the timeline up here to instead of show measures and beats, to show minutes and seconds. So then we no longer, although this will continue to be technically 120 beats per minute and 4/4, we don't have to worry about it. What we see here is actually seconds. So the grid here represents what happens at 1 second, 2 seconds, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Good. Okay, so now we can move the items. So let's say that you want something to happen 6 seconds after the beginning of, so when the sound file begins that you'll be creating, or 6 seconds into the project, you can just drag the item left and right. You can move it anywhere you want. You can, if you have other tracks, you can also push it down to another track. But in this case, you just move it. Now, you might notice that when it moves, it tends to, well, it snaps. So in other words, if I am in this block at 2 seconds, then after that it goes, let's see, how much further is it going? So that would be 2.5 seconds, and it snaps there. And I guess this would be, it allows you to either put it at 2 seconds or to put it at 2.5 seconds, or put it at 3 seconds, etc., etc. And a similar thing would happen if we were using bars and beats, measures and beats. It would snap in this case because of the way that the grid is set up. It would snap to measure 2, beat 1. If I push it, it snaps to measure 2, beat 2, measure 2, beat 3, measure 2, beat, sorry, this is measure 2 beat 1, the beginning, measure 2 beat 2, 3, 4, and then next measure. Okay. The way we're displaying the the top, the grid here doesn't necessarily matter too much right at this moment, but I just don't want you to get distracted with the bars and beats right now. So I put it back to seconds. Okay. Now, of course, there's some similarities where the grid lines are because of the tempo, because it's 120 BPMs. So good. So we can move it. Now, what if you wanted to move it right here? What if I just want that to start right here? Can I do that? Of course you can. All you have to do is disable snap. So this looks like a magnet, a horseshoe magnet. And when it's off, you can now move the items anywhere you want. So which of these is better? It depends. If you're working in very precise, you want things to be very precise rhythmically, then you want this to be on sometimes. It just depends. When I work with audio, so like spoken word, that sort of thing, or if you're working on a podcast or something like that, you definitely don't need to worry about that. But it may be handy, it may come in handy. It just depends. Okay. So sometimes you want fine tune. Usually I turn this on and off depending on what I need. So anyway, so again, if I want this to happen at 3 seconds and something, sorry, this is actually 4 seconds and something, I now put it over here. And then if I start my playback, nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens. And then 4 seconds and something, it starts playing. Okay. If you want to know exactly where your item is in relationship to the rest, you can double click, and up here it gives you an exact location. It gives you the position and it gives you the length. And you can show that length in time or beats. So for instance, if you're working in measures and beats, it may be helpful. Let's say I put it, let me turn this on. Let's say I wanted to start on measure 3, beat 2. That's where it is now, right? I double click. And now if I have to switch it to beats, and now it says 3, the first 3 indicates the measure. That second one indicates the beat. So that's measure 3, beat 2, and the length of the item is coincidentally also 3 measures and 2 beats. That's an interesting coincidence. Okay, so there's that. So there's no limit to where you can put it. You can put it, you can move it. You don't have to commit to anything. So it's kind of the nice thing about working with digital audio workstation programs, that you can just, you could move things around till your heart's content. Okay, so that's good. Right now, if you want to be, so let's say you want it to be, let's say we are in minutes in bars and beats like now. Let's say you want to be able to snap at the 8th note level, because right now it's snapping at the quarter note level. Every time I move and I have my snap feature on, it moves from one quarter to the next. But what if I want to be able to go at the 8th note level? Then you would have to right click here during this. The grid lines are this is what activates the grid lines, and then you can right click and a window shows up, and this tells you what your grid spacing is. So how often do I see a line? In this case, it's every quarter. Do you want it to be something else? You can make it an 8th note. You can actually enter any number you want over here. This is a very powerful feature. Don't underestimate it. I've used this a lot when I do things that are kind of intricate rhythmically. And I've noticed even programs like Logic can't do this. So there's no limit to how you can divide the beat. You can divide it into 21 parts if you want to. For those of you interested in that stuff. And so anyway, so there's that. And now when I go back up here, now I have additional lines. So now when I snap, it's going to snap every 8th note. So this is measure 2, beat 1, measure 2, second part of beat 1, measure 2, beat 2, etc. Okay? And, say you wanted it to be a triplet, you could change that, etc. Okay? Very good. Now let's talk about, so let's now get rid of this. Let's get rid of the lines. And let's now go back to minutes and seconds, okay? Again, I just don't want you to get distracted with all that stuff. So let's say that I have this much sound, and I only want the first 3 notes of the scale, because I just want the first 3 notes. So how do I do that? Where you can trim an item. So by to trim an item, you move your cursor to the right. You go all the way to the edge on one side or the other, and you'll notice that the cursor changes shape. It has got a little kind of like a little parentheses side, and then it has arrows. And what you can do now is you can trim it. You can make it shorter, and you could do it both ways. So in this case, I'm going to go here. I want to trim it so that all I have is now just the first 3 notes. And that's that. So this actually doesn't mean, this is very important, doesn't mean you've changed the sound file. Because remember, the scale is a sound file. But what Reaper is doing now is it's referring to that sound file. But it's not actually changing it. So it's non-destructive, which is very, very important. So you can cut this, you can replace it, you can repeat it, and you won't be affecting the original sound file, okay? So that's very good. So let's say that that's what I want. Now I can take that and I can move it around, okay? Now let's say that I want, or I change my mind. I want 4 notes. I don't want 3. Then I can, this is still the original. So I trimmed it. Now I can change my mind and I can expand it. What I'm doing now is I'm just adding a little bit more of that original scale, or I can now remove a little bit of that, okay? So again, you're not necessarily committed to this, but you know, this is it. If I now were to make an audio file out of this, what would happen is there would be no sound for about 2-3 seconds, and then you would hear this. That's it, okay? Now you can also do more things, okay? So for example, you can split. So instead of trim an item, so let's go back to the original file, okay? By the way, if you have trimmed it and then you're trying to go back to the original length, when you start expanding, you'll get to a point where you get these little edges over here. And at that point, it's actually starting over. And we'll talk about that, what that is, but that's how you know that you're done. Okay, so let's just say that I only want this note and this note. Now I could go here and just trim to here, and then, I don't know, trim to here, etc., etc. Or a very convenient way to do it is to splice. So what you could do is you can put your play bar wherever you want to splice. So let's say right before this note. It's very, very useful to zoom in because you actually can't see exactly where you are when you zoomed out too much. So for example, if I put my play bar here, it looks like I'm right at the beginning, but if I zoom in very carefully, you see that there's a little bit of a gap. So when you're splicing, when you're cutting sound, you generally want to go right before the sound actually begins. You don't want to go too far into it. You don't want to go too far before it. You want to go just before. And then you press the letter S. So the letter S is a shortcut for splice. Now I want to point your attention to something that Reaper's doing automatically. You see this little line that goes down and this little line that goes up? That's an automatic fade out and fade in. So if let me finish this. Okay, let's say I wanted, what did I say I wanted? I think I wanted these 2 notes. Okay, so I'm now going to click here to move my play bar, and I'm going to press S again. So what I have left now is this. So let me delete this and delete that. Now I have my 2 notes. But then if I zoom in to the very beginning, you'll see that what happens is Reaper is actually reducing the volume to 0 and then brings in the volume very quickly right at the beginning. That's called a fade in. And then it does the opposite at the end, so it fades out. Why does it do that? It does that to avoid clicks. Because when you cut sound in the middle of a waveform, so let's say that waveform is going up and down, if it's not at 0 point, it'll pop. It'll create a pop, which is really annoying and very, very ugly sounding. So essentially this is a built-in feature that avoids that. So you basically, as long as you're using Reaper and you have this feature on, which is actually controlled by this button right here called auto crossfade enabled, you always want this on. unless you have a really good reason not to have it on, then you don't have to worry about clicks and pops. Occasionally you might still get them, but for the most part, this will save you a lot of trouble. So you don't have to manually go in and change that. Now you can change the shape of it. If you want more of a fade, you can actually go in, and if you hover, so remember how if you put your cursor at the end, you can trim. If you put your cursor at the top corner, that controls the shape of the fade. So I can add more of a fade, or I can add a little less. You can also right click and change the shape of the fade if you want to. Generally, if you leave it alone, it's barely audible, which is kind of what you want, okay? Okay. So let's say I wanted to make the fade out a little bit more extreme. I would do. I don't know if you can tell. It's very subtle, but it's there. Okay, now you can also, well, you know what? Let me save that for a little later. Okay, I'll come right back to it. And once you've split, now here's an interesting thing about splitting. Let's go back a few steps. Okay. Okay, so let's just say that I'm back here. Now there's no split. So let's say that I split an item. Now I have two items, right? So now I can take this one, I can move it, etc. Now if I decide that I don't want these to be split anymore, I want them to be one. Now you'll notice that when you have your snap feature on, it'll also help you reposition things kind of nicely back together, or kind of snap back into place. Now, if you decide that you want these to be one item again, you could group them, which we'll get into later. But another way to do is you select them both, and then you right click and you go all the way to the end where it says heal splits in items, and it'll heal it. So in other words, it turns it back into a single item. Now, where that won't work is if you split it, and then let's say you split here, and now you try to heal it here. That won't work. Why won't it work? Because it won't match the original anymore. So it only won't work if you splice it, but then you put it back together as it was in the original, if that makes sense. Now you could create a new sound file, like let's say if I wanted to do this and combine it into one, you could do that, but what that will do is we'll generate a new sound file, which is fine, but it's just good to know. Right. Okay, so now you might notice that both these items are called scale, but they're not the same scale. So this one is these three notes, and this one is. So that's kind of annoying, right? So can you change that? Of course you can. So you can go here and we can change that to scale 1, apply, and we can change that to scale 2. So you can rename any item. Now you can't, so you could rename it. So as long as you have things split into individual items, you can change the name. That's very helpful for organization. Okay, so that's good. All right, so then again, these are all independent. They can move around wherever. Okay. Now you can also loop an item. So let's say that I want this. I'm going to get rid of this. Let's say that I want this to repeat a bunch of times. So if, okay, that takes us back to, let me go back a few steps here, okay? So say that I have my original scale. I have to go back. I'm just undoing, by the way. I'm just pressing undo. Say that I go back to the original scale and I put it right at the beginning. Okay, so say that I just want the scale to repeat 4 times. You could duplicate it, so you could do Command D to do it a bunch of times, Command D or Control D, and that's fine, and that works just fine. And then these are all individual items. Or you can loop it, and to loop it, you just basically drag. So you do the same thing that you would do when you're trimming, but you go the opposite direction. So you go past the end of the file. So the item has no more audio to go to, and so what it does is it loops, it starts over. In fact, if I do it all the way to the end, you'll notice that these are essentially the same thing twice. And this tells you that's the cutoff point. Okay, so I can continue doing this over and over and over and over and over. And these are loops. Now, if I wanted to do this in a smaller chunk, then, so let's say that I just want these 2 notes. So I trim it, and then I want to go loop, and I try to do that, it won't work. Why doesn't it work? Because it thinks that I'm trying to go back to the original size. So I would have to then create a new sound file that only contains these 2 notes. And to do that, you actually just go to, you right click and you do glue items. And once you glue it, you now have a brand new sound file, which Reaper has created. And now, because it doesn't have any more sound, the only thing it has is these 2 notes, now I can loop it. But what I cannot do is go back to the original, because this is what Reaper is doing now, is referring to a new sound file that only has those 2 notes. So you have to be careful when you do it. Now, it's non-destructive, meaning that it's not actually replacing the original sound file, it just creates a new one, okay? But if I wanted to go back to my original one, I will now have to go find it, insert, let's go here, media file, and then I'm just going to put my scale back in here. Okay. So anyway, so if I go to the beginning, let's leave this here for a second. So let's do, so you can hear what this loop sounds like. Yeah, it added actually a little bit of a click. So here's what I'm going to do. Let me do that again. So remember I said to you that Reaper automatically adds a fade in and out. You sometimes have to exaggerate it a little bit if you're about to if you're going to do loops, because you want it to make sure that it fades in and out very cleanly. Okay, I'm actually going to do a little time selection there. And I'm going to do it again. Glue items within time selection. Let's see if that's better. Let's loop this one. Okay, let me go back again. Oh, right, I didn't really change anything. Let's take that original scale. Okay, I'm going to do a better, I'm going to pay more closer attention now to where I'm actually splicing. I'm going to go right here. S, okay. All right, and I'm going to go here. And I'm going to right click, glue items. And let's see if I move this out of the way. And let's see if I still get any problems. I will say that occasionally using loops, you do get, depending on how you splice the file, you do get clicks, in which case it's better just to repeat the file, but just copy the item over and over. But let's see. That's good. Yeah, it was just a matter of splicing the file in a better place, like right before the actual sound, as opposed to wherever I did splice it, which I wasn't paying close attention. So there is that part with looping, is you want to make sure, since it's like something that repeats over and over, that you have a very nice clean starting and end point. But we'll get into this stuff later. Okay, so that's all well and good. And duplicating we talked about. Okay, let's talk about ripple editing. So this, okay, so let's say that I want to get rid of, so here's my scale. Here's my whole scale, okay? So say that I have this scale. So let's say that I want to get rid of the F, but only the F. So I want a scale that goes C, D, E, and then skips to G. Could I do that? Of course you can. So you could do it, the longer way to do it would be to go here, splice, get rid of that, and then you just press delete. Now notice what happens when I press delete. This item stays in place and there's a gap. So then I would have to go manually do this, which is okay. But if you do this sort of thing a lot, there's a better way to do it. I'm going to go back to the point where I splice both sides, but I haven't deleted it yet. And I'm going to press this button over here. So right now it's disabled, ripple editing. If I turn it on, it toggles through a couple of different settings. So it's either off, it's on for the one track that you're in, or it's on for all tracks together. This could be tricky because if you have lots of other tracks and you delete one chunk, it'll push all the items for the entire track down. So it'll assume that you're trying to get rid of that much of that space throughout the project. So just be careful with that. So I'm going to put it on the second one, which is with the two little lit boxes over here. And when I delete it, it now takes the sound that came after and it pushes it back. So basically, it's scoot. Let me go back and do it like this. So this is what I'm removing, right? You see what it did? It took this and it pushed it that way. Okay. And if I did the same thing here, if I get rid of this and then this, and I delete this much, then it gets shorter and shorter. Okay, so now it's going to have some missing notes. Okay, good. And again, of course, I could double click, rename any of these notes, etc., etc. Okay, now if you want to cut and paste, it's kind of like you would imagine. You can copy, you can cut, you could press, Control X or Command X, and then you could just paste over here. You can copy and paste and paste and paste and paste again. You could do that. Good. Okay, so let's now talk about the feature that I skipped a minute ago. That is called, there are two things. One is moving audio within an item, and the other one is to stretch the time. Okay, so what do I mean by that? So let's start with moving audio. So let's say, so here's a classic example, okay? So let me take the original scale. Actually, let's take a chunk of the scale. I'm just gonna copy it, paste it over here. Okay, so I have a few notes of a scale. So let's just say that I want only this note right here, okay? And I'm not that zoomed in, I'm not paying very close attention. And I splice here, and I splice here. So it's kind of a sloppy splice. Why is it a sloppy splice? Because I didn't really cut it right before the beginning of the sound. I sort of cut a little bit too far into it, too far before it, rather. Now I'm going to delete this, I'm going to delete this. This is what I have left. Now when I zoom in, a little later in the project, I realized that I've not done a good job splicing this. So let's say that I had something else happening at the same time. These two things would not be synced because there's a little bit of space here. So what you can do, rather than having to go back and trim and reposition, you can move the audio within the file. Because remember, this still refers to the original sound file that we dragged in. So anything, I could stretch this, sorry, not stretch, I could trim this all the way to include all the notes of the scale. So it's still referring to that. So if you press the Option key and then you drag to the left or to the right, you are now telling Reaper that you still want to keep the item the same size, but you want the audio to be scooted a little bit from within it. It's almost as if you were scrubbing through it. Okay, and then you could trim that away. And now my note starts. Whereas before, what I had was this. You see how there's like a little bit of a spillover from our previous note? It's a classic mistake people make. Okay, that's enough. Okay, so that's that. That's very, very helpful, particularly for your assignment. It'll be very helpful. Now, there's another feature that's very, very cool, which allows you to stretch an item. So let's say that I have this note and it's only lasting 1.5 seconds, but I really want it to last 2 seconds. I could actually press Option, so the same key that I use to move the audio. If I move my cursor to the edge, you get a little bit, like looks like a fist. You can now drag, so this is different than trimming, very different than trimming. You can actually drag the amount of audio that you're currently working with, and you could stretch it so that it fits a specific length of time. So is the difference clear? I hope so. So what I've done now is I haven't changed, I basically effectively made a note that used to last 1.5 seconds. I haven't changed the note itself, I've just changed the time stretch. Now this is, you have to keep in mind that if you do this too much, it'll affect the quality of the file. It becomes noticeable. But if it's a subtle thing, it could be extremely useful and powerful. So here's the difference. Okay, you see that's the new version, and this is the one before I stretched it. It's shorter. Okay, now if you again, if I take this and I do it for a long stretch, you see, then it begins to sound really artificial because I'm basically effectively creating, kind of corrupting the quality in a sense of the file. So it's really helpful in small increments, very powerful. And you could do it the opposite way too. You could also reduce it this way. You can make it shorter. Okay, that's actually generally better than the other way around. And is that it? I think that's actually it. I've covered everything I wanted to cover. So good.